This is a review for EXP 3505 Cognition Exam 3, and we begin with Lecture 13, Everyday Memory, and this corresponds to Chapter 8 in the textbook. So as we noted, the previous research that we've discussed so far up to this point was mostly consisted of word lists, memory for word lists, and the various factors that affect how well people remember these kinds of information. However, the kinds of information that people typically think of as memory doesn't consist of arbitrary list of words, but rather things having to do with their lives and events that have taken place in their lives and things that are important to them that they remember from their actual experience. And so we can define a different class of memory, which is autobiographical memory, which consists of recollected events that belong to a person's past. So this isn't just arbitrary facts and figures, but this has to do with specific things that relate to an individual and his or her experience. It involves mental time travel, so it has a component of episodic memory to it, and it's multidimensional. It's spatial, emotional, and sensory. It has not just specific individual facts, but has all these components. There's components that are similar to the experience themselves, and so you can remember something with fondness and feel good thinking about it or feel bad thinking about it. You can remember the sights and smells and so on and so forth, just as you do as you originally experience it. And so this, in some sense, can be thought of as replaying the recording of one's original experiences as somebody underwent those experiences. So autobiographic memory has a couple of specific characteristics. One of them is that it has a sensory component. As we said, it's multisensory. You can have sights, visual, auditory, even other senses, gustatory elements to it. And so research has shown that it really does have this, that the sensory component is really essential to it. So it's not just something we consider epiphenomenal, which means that it feels as if there are these components to it, but it's not really essential to the way the memory is encoded. Studies have shown that people who have actual deficits in higher level perceptual processing, so people who aren't able to recognize objects and experience loss of, they will often experience loss of autobiographical memory. And so this shows a visual experience, in this case, plays a role in forming and retrieving autobiographical memory. There really is something about the experience, reliving that experience of seeing that mountain vista when you hiked up to the top of a mountain or something like that, really is essential to the way the memory is encoded. Getting more general into the question of what type of information is encoded over time, what type of events are memories. So people experience many millions of experiences that they don't remember. Most of the information we experience, most of our lives are to some extent forgotten. But of course we remember a lot as well. And the question is, what type of things do we remember and what type of things do we not remember? And so there's evidence that things that are significant in a person's life are remembered. This is consistent with people's general expectations that the things that are significant, something really bad or something really good that took place, ends up being remembered. Highly emotional events, and that's related, things that cause a lot of emotion, and transition points, changes, times of change in one's life. And we pointed out at this point in the lecture that when thinking about what's remembered in autobiographical memory, we have to remember the function of autobiographical memory. The point is not just to be able to have something to do when you're sitting around on a board and you can kind of relive something that happened years ago, but rather there's a purpose to autobiographical memory. And things that are significant and things that cause lots of emotion are often likely to have a lot of functional significance as well. They're likely to be important, and then in remembering those events, it might lead you to change your behavior now. And it might help you to direct your goals and your plans and your behaviors in the present. So as far as things that we know people remember and people forget, a very striking example of forgetting is childhood or infantile amnesia. And this is the inability of adults to retrieve episodic memories from before the ages of 2 to 4, depending on the person. Some people have memories from before 4 years old. Many don't have any until later. Some people have autobiographical memories that go back to age 3, but very, very infrequently do people have memories from before the age of 2. And so there's this really catastrophic loss of episodic memory, even though children themselves may remember events that took place a month ago or even half a year ago at age 4. But into adulthood, these tend to disappear. And besides this complete loss of memory for age 4 or sooner, there's also a more general lag of reduced memory from before age 10. So people may have some memories from the time that they're 7 or 8, but those will be much less compared to their memories from, say, their teenage years. So why does childhood infantile amnesia occur? Well, it's probably not a failure to encode in the first place, because as we said, memories are present, so children can show memory for events that took place in the past, even young children. So it does end up being encoded. It's not as if it's never encoded. And we were going to discuss research that shows that even 6 months olds or 2-month olds can recall some kind of information. For instance, in Rovi Collier's work, she showed that babies who learned how to kick and get a mobile to turn would remember. 2-month-olds would remember that technique for days later, and 6-month-olds can remember that information for weeks later. So the memory is encoded. However, as people develop and grow and make their way into adulthood, that information is lost. So there are a couple of different hypotheses that have been proposed. One is that it's simply neurological, that the hippocampus we know is underdeveloped until around age 4. And we know that the hippocampus, of course, is very essential in memory formation and in particular in consolidation. And that's the forming of really long-term memories that are really stable. In other words, emotional. Varying children may process emotional information differently. And what is often found is that certain early emotional experiences are sometimes remembered. So emotion can really play an important role. And the point is that for children, since they experience emotions differently, then by the time one's an adult, those memories may no longer have the emotional resonance that they did. It may not mean the same thing to you anymore, and therefore it may not trigger the same kind of emotional response and not be remembered as well. So having a candy taken away as a young child may be very traumatic, but that is no longer going to be perceived as traumatic years later, and therefore, since it doesn't have the same sort of emotional weight, it may be forgotten. Finally, linguistic. It is an observation that language develops around the same time as infantile amnesia starts to go away. And so it's been proposed that language and memory may be deeply related, and that language may allow rehearsal and elaboration, and that only when language is fully developed do memories start to become really articulated and really stable. The next thing we talked about was a more general phenomenon called the reminiscence bump. And this is the observation that people who are in their middle age, in this example, for instance, it's a 55-year-old memory, will often show this thing called the reminiscence bump, which is a glut of memory from a specific time of year, starting from early adulthood, well, actually teenage years, so it starts to rise during the teenage years, and then hits the bump in early adulthood, late teenage and early adulthood, and then memory starts to go down. Now what we mean by memory starting to go down is, in this case, if you ask people to recall events from their life, they'll be able generally to recall more events that took place in this time period from age, say, 16 to age 25 than events that took place before or afterwards. Then there's a bump towards the end as well, as you can see at age 50. This is a 55-year-old recalling events, but that's just recency. So it's not surprising that people can remember events that happened, say, a year or 2 years ago better than 10 years ago. But what is surprising is that there's this bump that goes up here, and that's much better than earlier memory, and then that goes down. Something special happens in this particular time period. And the question here again is why? So there are a couple of different hypotheses, and as we said, there's a couple of different names for these hypotheses. One is that the self-image hypothesis, which says that the teenage years and early adulthood are a time when people are assuming their self-image. And so those are particularly critical times in terms of people's self-image, and therefore that has functional significance. Again, coming back to the idea that the functional significance of memory is to be able to think about that information and reason about it and then use that information in the present. So when people are forming their self-image, they may remember something about the specific events that cause them to form that self-image, and that's going to inform the way they think about themselves now and perhaps their behavior. A cognitive explanation is that it's just that when encoding is better during periods of rapid change, there's a lot of things taking place, a lot of events, life events taking place. People are going through a lot of transition during high school years, during early adulthood, college, and so on and so forth. And then cultural life script suggests that it's not really about the life events per se. It's not about maturation, self-image, but rather it has to do with the way we tell stories about our lives. These shared expectations which structure recall. So everybody knows that you go to college, you get your first job. These are basic ideas that are similar across many individuals. And then during recall, the idea is that people will use those as focus points to build their memories around. So it's really more about a retrieval kind of process based on this shared cultural life script. So one source of evidence with regard to some of these hypotheses is that that the reminiscence bump seems to depend much more on life experiences than on age per se. And the evidence for that is that when people emigrate later in life, so here we have people who emigrated at age 20 to 24, and here in the blue we have people emigrated at age 34 to 35. And now they're also remembering things at age 55, just like the previous experiment. And what you see here is that for people who emigrated, sorry, I have a little bit of a cold, for people who emigrated at age 20 to 24, you see this massive reminiscence bump, similar to the original one, but even more extreme. But for those who immigrated later in life, what you see is the reminiscence bump shifts, and shifts to around before the point and after the point at which they emigrated. And this is most supportive of cognitive hypothesis, but is also related to the self-image hypothesis. And so what this suggests is that when times of tremendous transition are taking place, people encode that information and remember that information better. Because immigrants, people who left their home country at a later time in life, have many memories from around that time period, before and after that time period. Emotion is also extremely important in terms of what gets remembered and what doesn't. And so several studies have shown that people who are shown arousing words remember those words better than neutral ones. And also the amygdala, which is a portion of the brain that we know is involved in emotional processing, is very activated due to those emotionally stimulated words. And so this shows a direct link between emotion and memory. One particularly compelling example of highly emotional memories are so-called flashbulb memories, which refer to memories for events that are highly shocking and usually public kind of viewed events. And these are things such as 9/11, where there was a national awareness of a particular event that was taking place across a particular time period. And what people often report in relation to their memories for such events is that they usually feel that they're very detailed and resistant to forgetting. So while people will often feel that their memory for typical events will fade over time, flashbulb memories, people often report that they can remember very specific details of what they were doing or how they experienced those events with a lot of fidelity. So their memory remains good over time. So this is what people report, but the question is this in fact veridical? I'm sorry for my colleague sneezing in the background there. So there have been a couple of different studies that have actually tried to look at memories for flashbulb types of events. And so, as I mentioned, the Challenger disaster is one of the first types of public disaster events where psychologists went and actually studied people's memories for this event. So Neisser and Harsh asked for people's memories of the Challenger explosion after one day. They went and got people's recollections of where they were and what they were doing, and then tested their memories 2 to 3 years later. And what they found was that accuracy for details actually declined with time. So similar to other kinds of memories, they found people forgot things. but confidence in people's memories was very high. So here's an example of a transcript. I'm not going to read through it, but somebody remembered being in one place in religion class when hearing about it. I remember who told them, and then back in 2 years later, and so this was 1986, this was a couple of days after the event took place. And then 2 years later, when they were reporting the same events, the details changed rather dramatically. And so here's they're remembering hearing it from somebody, a different source, and being in a different location. And the point was from this study was that, first of all, that these kinds of errors in memory do creep in, similar to other kinds of memories. But nevertheless, people are often very confident in their memories of those events. Tellerico and Rubin did a study of 9/11, and they asked people to tell them about everyday events or flashbulb events, and similar to the Nice and Harsh, they asked people to do this a day after the event, one day after the event, multiple days, up to almost a year after the event, for a normal everyday event and a flashbulb memory. This way they were able to check people's, compare memories for the everyday event versus the flashbulb memory. And what they found was that, similar to Nice and Harsh, there was generally decay for both the flashbulb and everyday memory events, and this difference here is not significant between these. So their memories, actually, the number of details they can remember was not significantly different, and both types of memories decayed. However, their belief in their memory for the flashbulb event was much stronger, so even 224 days out, they still rated their memory for that event as being much higher than for an everyday event. However, a study by Davidson et al. Found somewhat conflicting results to the Tellerico and Rubin, also studying 9/11. What they did was they provide cues. They had people remember an everyday event, a 9/11 event, and then gave people cues. Tell me about this detail. You were in the, in your dorm room, and then what happened? And they did the same thing for an everyday event. And what they found was that if they compared people's memories for 9/11 versus for an everyday event, people's memory for 9/11 actually matched better with their memory 1 year later, matched better with their memory from a day after. So it seems as if they were actually remembering correctly for 9/11 better than for the everyday event. And this is so there's some evidence here that the flashbulb memory is remembered better. Certainly not perfectly, as you can see. It's not at 100%, but it is better than the everyday event. And in addition, if you look at the right graph, they found that 100% of people were able to at least remember some detail accurately, which wasn't true for the everyday event, which wasn't at 100%. So what are we to make of this? Well, it's certainly the case that memory shocking events may be somewhat better, but it's certainly not as good as people think. It does decay with time, even though people often report that they are able to remember these details with certainty years after the event. So there is a bit of an illusion to the flashbulb memory. There's a sense in which it seems as if the memory cannot decay and you can't be wrong about the detail, but in fact you can. So why would there be any better memory for it, and why, in fact, do people feel as if the memories are better? And some possible reasons are emotional content leads to stronger encoding, and also rehearsal. So the fact that people think about 9/11, think about other large-scale events that have taken place, talk about it, see the media discuss it, this leads to people thinking about it, rehearsing it, and as we know, rehearsal can improve encoding and storage in long-term memory. And just the fact that people talk about it also makes it likely that they think, because they're rehearsing it, may make it also likely that they think that they remember the details better than they actually do. The next topic we discussed was the idea of constructive encoding in memory. And so talking about flashbulb memories and things like episodic memory can give one the impression that what we do when we remember is we just take the information that was encoded and just in a kind of high fidelity way replay that information. Similar to the way we experienced it, we just play the tape back and relive those events in order to remember things. However, the idea of constructive encoding is that what you remember is not just based on what you experienced, but it's based on your knowledge and beliefs as well. And that, in fact, the way we remember things isn't just based on what happened, but what we think happened and what we believe happened. And the evidence for this is that you can sometimes introduce information, change information that's supposedly in memory, and then people will end up remembering things differently. So some very strong evidence for this comes from false memories. People often remember a semantically consistent word as having been on a list, and we did this in class. I showed you a word list. You had to remember it, and it was a lot of words that were consistent with the word needle. So you had haystack and sewing and so on and so forth, but the word needle wasn't there, and many people report having seen the word needle there even though it wasn't there. And the reason is because you may believe that the word was there because it makes sense, but you don't in fact you did not in fact see that word. And what this suggests is that you can remember something based on the fact that you think it's true rather than it having been true. We also did an example, a visual example of this, where I showed you a picture and you had to remember which items were in the scene. And what will often show up in these kinds of experiments that use this kind of technique is that people will remember items that are likely to be in the scene even if they weren't there. I think the example we used was papers, which there are no, a computer terminal, which isn't actually in the scene, but people often remember seeing one because it's consistent with the scene. And this brings us to the idea of schemas and scripts. A schema is basic knowledge about a category of experience, so you may know about offices, or you may know about a basketball game or a baseball game, and what kind of things should be there. And then what will often happen is that information that you may not have actually seen there will creep into your memory of it. So even if you didn't see a computer terminal in an office, you may remember seeing one because it's consistent with one being there based on this shared schema that we all have of what an office will typically contain. Scripts are related, but they relate. It's an idea of knowing what happens in a certain kind of scene. So, standing in line at a store, you kind of have a script of what typically happens. You get in behind the person behind you. You wait. You unload your packages. You give the person, the checkout person, the payment, and so on and so forth. And what will often happen is people may remember some detail of having taken place, even if it didn't happen. So, let's say you were able to skip the line and somehow you got right on up to the register. Later on, somebody you may remember having stood on line even though it didn't take place. And a researcher who was very influential in investigating false memories was Elizabeth Loftus, and she gained a lot of notoriety because she became an expert witness in some very controversial court cases where people who are undergoing therapy claimed to have recovered repressed memories. And so these were people who, for most of their lives, did not accuse their parent. Usually, typically, this was somebody accusing a parent of sexual abuse. And then years later saying that although they didn't remember it until they went to therapy, that under therapeutic conditions, they recovered those repressed memories. And Elizabeth Loftus came in to say that there was tremendous concern that through the therapeutic process, these people were actually experiencing false memories, and that false memories can occur due to things like suggestion, and when beliefs are changed, or when people start to imagine what kind of things can happen, sometimes false memories can occur. And so there's some debate here about whether a lot of these suppressed memories were real or not, or whether they were simply happening because of the therapeutic process. So Loftus had done a lot of research on false memories prior to this, showing that people were very susceptible, their memories were very vulnerable to suggestion. So in this study, for instance, people watched slides of a car accident and afterward were asked a question containing a suggestive or false piece of information. So for example, Loftus might ask somebody, did another car pass when the vehicle was at the yield sign? Now let's say the people who had originally seen the slides had actually seen a stop sign. Well, they were now given a little sly suggestion that in fact it was a yield sign, and later people remembered the suggested and not the true information. So they remembered seeing a yield sign even though they had originally seen a stop sign because the suggestion had been placed there. Here, a suggestive question is not a false information, but just the kind of language that's used when asking the question can change the way people remember. And so when people heard that the cars, if the question they were asked was how far were the cars going when they hit each other versus when they smashed each other, people would say they went faster. They remember them going faster when the question was smashed versus hit. And when they heard smash, they would also more likely to remember that there was broken glass there. So these suggest that post-event questioning can greatly influence the way people remember information. And Loftus even showed that people could remember completely false memories. And so in the Lost in the Mall technique, Loftus had some siblings who were Confederates in an experiment come in together. Two of the siblings, or several of the siblings, were in on it, and then they went and recalled events from their childhood. And what happened was the Confederates would claim that they had remembered an event that really had never taken place. And then they asked the person who was actually the subject of the experiment if they remembered. And what they found was that in their first interview, they said, no, I don't remember being lost in the mall. But by the second interview, they started to remember this completely fabricated event. And by the third interview, they're remembering it. About a quarter of subjects remembered this completely false event. And as I mentioned, even after subjects were told it was false at the end, they often said that they now remembered the event and were certain that it had taken place. And reconsolidation is the idea that when a memory is brought up and remembered and reactivated, it's particularly susceptible to new information and potentially contamination from that new information. So we discussed a study by Chen et al. In which participants watched an episode of 24, and then some participants had a recall task where they had to recall details from the show, and half the participants did not do that recall task. And then both groups, the ones that did the recall and the ones that didn't, were exposed to misinformation using a Loftus-like type of question procedure. And then what they found was that the recall group was more susceptible to misinformation, the ones who had to recall the information. That suggests by the act of bringing up the information leads to this idea of reconsolidation, where the information can be changed by virtue of the fact that the memory is reactivated. And as we mentioned, there's been some very interesting recent work to suggest that this can also be used for positive effects in relation to highly negative memories, where people have very strong negative associations with memory, or rather with a particular memory that has a very strong negative association. Those negative associations may be overwritten using a reconsolidation technique. And so we talked about a study by Schiller et al. In participants who received associative learning tasks where they associated a particular visual stimulus, a certain color square, with a shock. And they had three groups, some of whom, after they had been trained on that, came back, and some of those participants were reintroduced to that stimulus again, so the particular square with the shock, and then underwent extinction. And extinction is where you see the stimulus without the negative associate, so without the shock. So some participants briefly saw the stimulus with the shock again and then underwent extinction. Some participants had no reminder of the original memory, and some had it, but there was a long delay between when they had the reactivation and then had the extinction process. And what Schiller et al. Found was that those participants who immediately after or almost immediately, 10 minutes after they had the reactivation of the original memory, were introduced with the extinction, those participants later on, when they came back, and that's this bar over here, this plot over here, and this bar is the ones who had that extinction process immediately after reactivation, and they, a day later, no longer showed a fear response to the visual stimulus, which the other participants did. And what this suggests is that the act of reactivation allowed them to overwrite that negative memory, that negative association. We also discussed some errors in eyewitness testimony and the implications of those. One of the things we discussed was the weapons focus, and that's simply the idea that if there's a very salient piece of information in taking place in a scene, such as a shooting, then that will be to the detriment of a lot of other memory in a scene. So, For instance, if there's a shooting such as green, then people will not remember details about the perpetrator as well. So orange versus green, orange without a shooting, about the victim, or even about the weapon itself. So just the fact that there's a highly salient piece of information there that draws attention away and requires a lot of emotional processing seems to cause people to forget lots of details. We also mentioned the idea that can sometimes be contamination information from one's memory due to information later on. So similar to what we mentioned from Loftus, where they introduce false information through questions. In this case, just seeing an event after that follows an earlier event can sometimes lead to contamination of the memory of the original event. So, for instance, in this study, participants viewed films of either a male teacher reading to students or a female teacher reading to students, and then later saw a film of the female teacher getting robbed. And later on, they had to pick a robber from a photo spread. And what they found was that participants who had earlier viewed a film of a male teacher reading to students, later they chose that male robber as being, the male teacher as being the person who robbed the female teacher later on. If they choose it at 60%, so pretty frequently they chose that male teacher from the photo spread if the actual robber is not in the photo spread. So this is the case here where the green is when these are participants who saw, previously seen the male teacher reading to the students, and now they are choosing that male teacher from the photo spread as long as the actual robber is not in the lineup. If the actual robbers are in the lineup, then thankfully these numbers go down considerably. But this is particularly troubling. It suggests that what's happening is there's an error in source monitoring. They have some memory of this male teacher. They don't remember where they became familiar with him. And then when later on they see the photo spread, that familiarity kicks in and they say, oh, I think that must be the person who robbed the female teacher. And as we mentioned, there's compelling evidence that there are many people who have been falsely convicted based on eyewitness testimonies, and estimated between 100,000 and 200,000. The Innocence Project usually goes after cases where people claim that they have been falsely convicted and there's DNA evidence and they've been able to exonerate a substantial number of people. And this suggests that there are probably many, many more out there who have been falsely convicted, and this suggests that eyewitness testimony can very often be faulty, and now we know from these kind of laboratory experiments just how faulty it can be. So the idea that you put a photo spread and you ask which one of these people perpetrated the crime seems to be a problematic one, because as we said, if once you put the idea that one of these people is the perpetrator, then it's easy enough for somebody to imagine that one of them could be the perpetrator, and then perhaps that is something they would call in memory. Giving confirming feedback is something that takes place during interview processes, and there's a study by Wilson Bradfield that demonstrates that simply giving people positive feedback, like saying you had correctly identified the person, will make them more confident in their original memory. And so, of course, this can have implications for interviewing processes. So what is being done, as we said, there are changes that are slowly happening in the criminal justice system, informed to some extent by the science. And some examples are, instead of showing a photo spread where you say that one of these people committed the crime, which one do you think it is, which allows people to sort of allow their imagination to run wild. If they think somebody may have done it, they'll end up confirming and say, oh, it must be this person. Instead, you show them a photo lineup in which the perpetrator may or may not be there, and that can deter them from starting to speculate. Use sequential presentation, so instead of having people compare a bunch of people in a photo spread, instead you show them one after the other, so they're not doing this kind of comparative processing. And then improve your interviewing techniques. And so there's a whole host of things one can do to not try to provide feedback, false information, try to put leading kinds of questions, and ultimately providing what could be misinformation that can override people's memory.